Why Gen Z isn't buying houses. And honestly, it's really not what you think. Okay, let's dive right into this, because I know this is a topic generating a massive amount of frustration right now. For basically every generation before this one, we were all sold the exact same story, right? Work hard, save a little bit of your paycheck, and eventually you'll own a home. It was the standard American formula, the whole shebang. But for the first time in modern history, an entire generation of young adults, Gen Z and younger millennials, are doing everything right. They're working, they're saving, and the math just fundamentally doesn't work. Today we're breaking down exactly what happened. And spoiler alert, this is a story about what actually broke in the economy, and it's way bigger and frankly much stranger than anyone is willing to say out loud.
Look, we have to start here, because for decades, the mainstream explanation for why young people couldn't buy homes was simple and honestly super insulting. You've heard it, I've heard it. Just cut out the daily lattes and the avocado toast, stop spending so much on takeout, and you'll magically have a down payment. It's this incredibly pervasive myth that if you don't own a home, well, it's just a lack of personal discipline. But let me be entirely clear right off the bat. This isn't a story about laziness. That old explanation actually made perfect sense in an era when homes were priced completely differently. But today, it is completely, totally out of touch with reality.
And the math instantly destroys that spending myth. Think about this. Back in the 1980s, the price-to-income ratio was basically 3-to-1, meaning a house cost roughly 3 times the average yearly income. If you saved diligently, you could absolutely bridge that gap. It was doable. But today, in many major U.S. metros, that ratio isn't 3-to-1 anymore. We're talking 7, 8, and in some places up to 10-to-1. 10-to-1. You could literally cut out every single latte and avocado toast for the rest of your natural life, and you can never outsave a 10-to-1 income gap. The math is just broken.
So, that brings up a pretty massive question. If it's not our spending habits, and it's definitely not some sudden generational lack of discipline, what actually changed? Well, to figure that out, we have to pull back the curtain on the hidden structural antagonists of the modern housing market. There are these huge macroeconomic forces at play here that, for whatever reason, rarely make it into the daily news headlines.
The very first major hurdle, it's not a demand problem, it's a supply problem, and it is absolutely massive. We constantly hear about how many people want to buy homes, but we very, very rarely hear about how fundamentally few homes actually exist for them to buy.
To really get where the shortage came from, we kind of have to look back to before 2008. Back then, the U.S. was experiencing a relatively healthy, normal pace of housing construction. But then the 2008 housing crash happened, and home building just plummeted, fell off a cliff. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. It never fully recovered. Post-2008, an entire generation of home builders scaled back or went completely out of business. So for over a decade and a half, this country has been building meaningfully fewer homes per year than our population growth actually requires. We are literally millions of homes short, just on a basic demographic level. And the second part of that supply issue comes down to restrictive zoning laws. Even when builders really want to build, local regulations in huge parts of the country dictate exactly what can legally go on residential land. And more often than not, those zoning laws strictly limit construction to single, detached homes with large yards. Basically, it acts like this invisible, legal barrier that artificially caps the supply of starter homes, townhomes, and smaller units. You know, the exact type of dense housing that cities are absolutely desperate for right now. Which brings us to this harsh, unavoidable reality. You just can't outsave a shortage. I really want that to sink in for a second. If there simply aren't enough homes being built where people actually need to live, the prices of the existing homes are going to climb and climb. Regardless of how financially disciplined you are as a buyer, you are fighting a structural deficit. It's literally like playing a game of musical chairs, except someone took away half the chairs before the music even started playing.
But wait, because it actually gets crazier. Let's say a rare starter home does pop up on the market. You really have to ask yourself, who are you actually competing against to get those keys? If you think it's just, other young couples or local first-time buyers trying to get a foothold in the neighborhood, you are missing a massive piece of the modern real estate puzzle.
Over the past decade, a growing and frankly massive slice of the home buying pie has been completely swallowed up by institutional investors. We're talking about large firms and giant corporations buying up single-family homes specifically to rent them back out. They become a meaningfully larger share of buyers in tons of U.S. markets, and they are completely absorbing the exact inventory of affordable starter homes that traditionally would have gone to a first-time entry-level buyer. And let me tell you, this is not a fair fight. Picture this. On one side, you have a typical retail first-time buyer. They're scraping together a 5% down payment, and then they have to sweat it out, waiting 30 to 45 days for mortgage approval and an appraisal, right?
But on the other side, you have an institutional investor with literally billions in capital, making rapid, all-cash offers and closing in a matter of days. If you're a seller, you're almost always going to take the fast cash over the complicated mortgage. So it was never really about your personal financial discipline. You were quite literally bidding against Wall Street.
Okay, let's just take a breath here. Because looking at this broken math, the decades of underbuilding, and these massive corporate cash buyers, you'd be totally forgiven for throwing your hands up and asking, is it actually hopeless? I mean, it's incredibly frustrating, and it really feels like the whole market is rigged against anyone who doesn't already own property. But before we spiral into pure doom and gloom, we need to shift gears. Because while the old rules are absolutely dead and buried, homeownership itself is not.
The absolute most crucial point to remember is this. The picture isn't permanently frozen. The market is not static. Home ownership rates among younger buyers haven't collapsed to zero. Plenty of people are still buying. They're just doing it later in life, and more importantly, they're doing it differently. Plus, the macroeconomic environment is always shifting. Interest rate cycles move up and down over time, and beautifully, zoning reform is genuinely gaining momentum in a growing number of cities, loosening up those old restrictions to finally allow for more starter homes. So, let's talk about the new housing playbook. These are the strategies that actually move the needle.
Because the environment has fundamentally changed, the old advice just won't work anymore. The advice your parents gave you? It simply doesn't apply to a market they never had to navigate. So let's walk through 3 critical, modern strategies. First up, the metro matters way more than your discipline. The math in those hyper-competitive coastal cities is just brutal. But there are dozens of mid-sized U.S. cities with incredibly strong job markets, far lower home prices, and way less investor competition. Sometimes, relocating is literally the strongest financial move you can make. Second, please apply for first-time buyer programs. Many states and employers offer thousands of dollars in down payment assistance. A huge percentage of eligible buyers never even apply simply because they have no idea these programs exist. Don't leave free money on the table. And third, utilize house hacking. Buying a small duplex or multi-unit property and renting out part of it to offset your own mortgage is a classic working-class strategy. And honestly, it has quietly become one of the most realistic paths to ownership in today's expensive markets. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a massive reframe for your mindset. This was never a story about personal failure. Seriously, if you have been beating yourself up because you're in your late 20s or your 30s and you're still renting, you need to let that guilt go right now. You are dealing with a housing supply that stopped keeping pace with the population decades ago. You're dealing with outdated zoning rules and a completely new category of massive institutional buyers that didn't even exist at this scale a generation ago.
Here is your final reality check. The people who bought homes at age 25 back in 1985, they were not smarter than you. They were not more disciplined than the people struggling to buy a home at 32 today. Not at all. They were just operating inside a completely different, significantly easier market with normal math. Recognizing these structural shortages and institutional hurdles isn't an excuse to just give up. It's actually the exact opposite. It is the very first piece of accurate information you need so you can stop feeling guilty and start making a real, modernized plan.
Now that you know you can't just budget your way out of a massive structural shortage, and you know the new playbook involves being flexible about your location or the type of property you buy, I want you to ask yourself this one provocative question. What is actually stopping you from taking action right now? Is it truly the price? Is it maybe an unwillingness to change locations? Or is it something else entirely holding you back from utilizing this new playbook? Think on that, evaluate your own local market, and start planning your next move.